Now we'll go over some tips and things that you may want to know as you're completing your first kinship assignment. You always want to avoid using the first person. So instead of saying things like, I observed medication, or I walked through the home, or I explained to the family the discipline policy, you would use things like, medications were observed locked as evidenced by blank. Or a walkthrough of the home was completed on this date, and everything was observed to be appropriate and safe for children. Or instead of explain to the family the discipline policy, you would state, the discipline policy was explained to the family on the following date. If you cannot avoid using the first person, you would change it. Instead of saying, I told the family, you would state, this contractor or this assessor or this provider educated the family on the following topics during the home visit. Remember, this document could become a legal document. It could be reviewed by supervisors, program directors, attorneys, and judges. You could be called to testify regarding the home study that you complete. And it is the cross-examining attorney's job to discredit you. So it could include criticism of your writing and overall documentation. So any unprofessional language or unprofessional style in the way you type up your study could automatically raise questions about your overall assessment skills. Also avoid stating opinions that aren't backed up by facts or observations. So you wouldn't just document the home appeared unsafe, but you may document instead, medications were stored out on the kitchen counter, or the home was observed to not have a fire extinguisher in place, or smoke detectors throughout the home were chirping as if the batteries were low. So instead of stating, the home appeared unsafe, you would be giving specifics as to what you observed that raised concern regarding the safety of the home. Or instead of stating the children were out of control, you could state, for example, during the interview, Sammy, age 6, ran around the home without pants or underpants on. He would approach the home study provider and scream at the top of his lungs. He would spit on his provider and his mother throughout the interview. The mother never redirected the behavior. You also want to use your assessment skills, meaning do not get stuck in the template. It's very important that although you do need to speak to each italicized prompt, that you're also providing some personalization, you're making it very specific to the family that you're studying, and you're using your clinician skills to capture the information you need. So, for example, if you're reporting a history of abuse or neglect that the caregiver has indicated to you, you want to follow up with specific details regarding that situation. Who was the abuser? What is their current contact with the abuser now? How long did the abuse occur? What happened? Who did they tell? Was anyone protective of them? How did the caregiver work through this situation in particular? Did they attend therapy? Did they rely on support from their church or from family members? Have they dealt with the specific history of abuse or neglect? So you want to be sure you're asking the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Same thing with history of domestic violence. You want to find out how long they remained in that relationship. Did they have children who were at risk because of the domestic violence, and how did they handle that? Did they allow the abuser to have unsupervised contact with the child after the divorce took place or after the relationship ended? Do they have a significant history of chaotic and dangerous relationships? So that's looking at those trend issues that may come up as a result of domestic violence history. Remember that every question in your kinship is asked for a reason. So if you aren't sure why you're asking a question, consider how you are doing assessment. So some common pitfalls you want to avoid are avoiding difficult topics. You want to appear confident. You want to ask questions even if they're uncomfortable for you. So if you appear confident, the caregiver will take your cues and feel more comfortable answering difficult questions. Also, you want to avoid asking questions that put the caregiver on the defensive. So, for example, if the caregiver is telling you a history of some difficult situations in their life and that their children had grown up to struggle with addiction and drugs, you would never want to say, why do you think all of your children grew up to be drug addicts? But more, your response could be, tell me about why you think your son struggled with drug addiction. Another way you could avoid putting the caregiver on the defensive, if they're telling you a history of domestic violence, you would never want to say, why did it take so long for you to leave your abusive husband? But instead, tell me about how you were able to leave that relationship. That must have been very difficult. So always, in difficult scenarios, you want to relate to the family, normalize difficult subjects to make it easier for them to talk about, and be sure you're never putting the caregiver on the defensive. If you ever have an uncooperative caregiver, a caregiver that's upset about participating in the home study, which sometimes seems to happen more often when the children are already placed in the home, you want to be sure as the assessor that you're empathizing with them. Example, you could say, it must be very frustrating to be a loving grandmother and be forced to give all of this information to CPS. I can understand your frustrations in sharing all of this information when the children have already been placed in the home. But then you want to take a step back, take the emotion out of it, and clearly explain the purpose of the study, emphasizing they have done nothing wrong, but all children in the custody of the department must be living in a home with a completed home study. If the caregiver is still upset when you arrive to complete the interview, you want to continue to be empathetic. Remember, this family's in crisis. They may just need anyone really, to listen to them. You want to validate their feelings and spend some time really building rapport before you jump right into the template and asking all of the detailed questions. If the caregiver downright refuses to provide information, example, you might find if they refuse to provide information related to their finances, related to their family of origin, their history of abuse or neglect, previous relationship history, they may say things like, I don't understand how those things apply to the home study today. Again, you want to be empathetic. You want to validate the fact that it's frustrating to have to give personal information to a stranger who is representative of CPS. Explain that you understand their feelings, but you cannot complete the home study without the required information. And unfortunately, it is a requirement in the template that DFPS uses to make a decision as to whether or not placement is appropriate. If the caregiver continues to refuse, you want to avoid any power struggles. You just simply want to collect the information they will provide, explain to the caregiver in a very non-threatening manner that the placement cannot be recommended if they don't provide all the necessary information, and you can't recommend a placement without completing a full home study. Again, if they're adamant and they refuse to comply, then you would just document this in the home study as an overall concern. Remember, your QM reviewer is not a proofreader. Now, we do have approved proofreaders through Monty & Associates who are happy to review your document for a $25 fee to make sure that all the grammar, punctuation, sentence structure is appropriate. So always know you can email the home study coordinators to request a proofreader list that you can utilize to be sure that your document is in tip-top shape when it goes to your QM reviewer. Your QM reviewer is really there to ensure that your assessment is completed thoroughly, and that the study addresses all of the italicized prompts, the minimum standards, etc. So always run a spelling grammar check prior to submission to your QM, and make corrections before you resubmit. If you aren't sure how to spell something like a medication, then you always want to use Google to look that up, and be sure you're using appropriate spacing between each of the sections. You want to spell out numbers 0 to 10, not list the numerical value. You want to be consistent, use commas appropriately and not overzealously, and review apostrophe rules for plural versus possessive and plural possessive to be sure that you're using that correctly. And overall, once you've used those insights into the typing of your report, then you should have a pretty good assessment overall and a good professional writing style throughout your report. And your QM will actually be the one who submits that final document to Monty & Associates to provide to DFPS. They will always copy you on the final submission, so you can save a copy of that for your records so that you can always refer back in the event that you were subpoenaed or end up having to go to court. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you the best as you begin the process of completing kinship studies.